Good afternoon or morning, Year 10. This is another video guide, but in this case, I'm actually going to talk you through something a little bit different. I'm going to talk you through a guide that I'm going to make available to you, and that is a series of PowerPoint slides that will take you through hopefully everything that you need to know to study The Woman in Black and to cover everything that you need to revise it next year when you come to have a look at this in the spin up to the GCSE exams. So this study guide is going to be broken down into 4 key sections: a pre-reading and background information section. And if you look at your written study guides that we've supplied to you, there's a section in there about that. Some plot and chapter analysis, some focus on the themes and techniques that come up, what the writer's writing about and how she writes about them. Broadly speaking, that's how every single one of the questions is going to be framed and what they'll be focused on. How does the writer use this? How does the writer show that? How does the writer represent this? There's always going to be a how. Explore the representations of this or that. So there's always going to be a tie between a thing the writer's writing about and how they're writing about it. And generically speaking, that covers everything that literature would ever really cover. What's a writer doing and why? How are they doing it? What's the impact on the reader? And then the final section will be how to go about writing about this in the novel. And I'll make this as specific to the Edexcel exam as possible, but I'll also make it more general in case anyone who's doing another exam board wants to use this and you want to share that with anyone you know who's at a different school doing a different exam board. You're more than welcome to do that. I'm happy for anybody to use this if it's of any use to them. So without further ado or don't, let's crack on with the first section. So the first thing to think about, though, is let's think about doing what we should never do and judge a book by its cover, because actually it's going to give us a clue to something to do with the genre of the text. What themes and ideas is it going to cover? Now, if you've already read the book, you already know this. But let's look at how the themes and ideas are reflected in the text. You can see we clearly have this shadowy figure that appears on 2 of these texts here, and that the colors are all muted. And here you've got the idea, you've got an image of someone who's also in darkness, holding a lantern, looking apprehensive. This is the cover of a play, a copy of the play script. These are 2 covers of various editions of the novel. So you can see, even by looking at the covers of various texts, you can get an impression of what this story is going to be about. We don't get a sense of pace or that this is going to be a text where it is dynamic. I really do like this text. I think the pacing is absolutely perfect for what it needs to be, but it is not a text of dramatic events chasing from place to place to place. It's not an action piece. There's not lots and lots of really big set pieces. This is a novel about tension and about atmosphere and about a creeping sense of unease. And I think you get a sense of the mystery and the unease from these covers. So here are just some terms that are going to be quite useful for you. There's a lot more terms than this that I will cover in this guide. Some things that are much more specific, but probably more usefully looked at in context of reading or examining key sections from the novel. But here are some key terms. Useful to put them in the. I mean, I would say in the back of your books. I mean, really, it's up to you, even on a separate piece of paper. But keeping a note of them somewhere. These key terms. So, Gothic fiction, sometimes referred to as Gothic horror. Interestingly enough, this is a style of novel that Susan Hill says her novel is not. I'd agree. It is not a Gothic fiction, but it does use elements of the Gothic, and it is within the Gothic tradition. It is following in the footsteps of that genre. Now, the Gothic genre was I was about to say an early 19th century genre of fiction, but actually there are some examples of it which occur very, very late in the 18th century. But that's a lesson on literary history that we don't need to go on. We think of this as a 19th century phenomenon, which is coming out of a kind of a reaction to the Industrial Revolution and a degree of rationalism, where people are starting to become interested in the supernatural and something called the sublime, this idea that nature can fill us with a sense of fearfulness and awe, a combination of excitement and terror. Something is so powerful and so overwhelming. And the idea of the Gothic novel is that it's a quest for atmosphere, a quest for a sense of a very powerful and overwhelming emotion, whether that be a positive one or a negative one. It borrows from romantic literature and has elements of horror in there as well. The Gothic has lots of key features that we'll look at in a little while. Things that fold themselves heavily into Susan Hill's writing and into the writing of many modern writers who write in that ghost horror genre. However, what we're looking at here is more the ghost story, this specific subset, or I think I would argue a genre of its own, that borrows heavily from those elements of the Gothic, but has a very set of specific rules that govern how it is done. They obviously involve, clearly, a ghost. Now, that's not to say a Gothic novel couldn't have a ghost in it, but a Gothic novel would also sometimes have what people perceive to be a ghost, but it turns out was actually a human actor. Or sometimes the supernatural element of a Gothic novel might be some other form of supernatural being, thinking about Dracula, or even bordering on that science fiction element, thinking about Frankenstein, two very, very well-known examples of Gothic in literature. But the ghost story is very specifically about the mystery surrounding a ghost, and it's not about the haunting per se. It's about the story behind the haunting, and that's kind of what separates a ghost story from a story with a ghost in it. Another key term that you need to know is the term of a frame narrative, the idea that there is a story within a story, that someone is in the novel comes along and says, "Oh, I'm going to tell you a story," which is a bit unusual because you're reading a story, but it's this event that sparks the telling of the story that we're going to be involved in. There needs to be a setup for this, and this frame narrative is really common, it's a particularly common feature of Gothic literature, it's a particularly common feature of Victorian writing, and it's something that Susan Hill uses. And the idea of pastiche. Pastiche is a term for a form of writing that imitates other distinct styles or genres, and there is no two ways about it. This is not a criticism of Hill's writing, or indeed of The Woman in Black, but it is very clearly a pastiche, borrowing heavily from a number of influences, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. So, one of the things to do to start with, and I would recommend that you have a go at this, is to try and use the chapter titles to guess what might happen, using your knowledge of genre, using your knowledge of the ghost story, the Gothic, because we've read things like this. You've come across things like this. You're not working in a void. You have an understanding of narrative, and you have an understanding of genre conventions and features. Make some predictions. What do you think? And then at the end of the novel, go back and have a look. How accurate were you? Or at the end of each chapter, go back and have a look. How accurate were you? One thing I would ask all of my students to do, and I think I would advise everybody studying this novel to do, is to make sure that you do short synopses of each of the chapters for yourself as you're going through. Around about 25 words would be ideal, something that just encapsulates what happens in the novel. And that's going to focus you on working out, okay, is this chapter about an event and a thing, or is this chapter really focused on style? Is it setting something up? It's really going to force you to make decisions about what you think is going on in the chapter, and that's going to get you engaged and thinking. And that's really the most important thing as you're going through, to reflect and think. You might want to do those as you're going, and then you might want to come back to them and do them again after you've read the novel through, because you might actually then have a clearer idea of what that novel, what that chapter was doing in context. You could do both. Come up with 2 little summaries as you go through. Either way, keeping a list of summaries would be useful, but start by having to guess. I mean, that's a fairly short task, 120 words. Keep it down to 10 for your initial guesses, and then as you're going through, do something a little bit bigger and broader. So each one of these chapters is titled, and you can use that title to think about what's going on. So here's just an example of what it might look like. You've got a table with your 10-word pre-reading synopsis, and then going back and doing that after the fact. So let's look a little bit at the literary background, and specifically the Gothic. Whilst it is not a Gothic novel, Susan Hill is very clear on this. She does recognize that it's clearly influenced and drawing upon the tradition. So there are Gothic elements at work in this novel, without a doubt. And some of the key things that are real dominant features of Gothic novels are things like isolated locations. People end up cut off, trapped in places that may be physically isolating, or they may be socially isolating, but they're in a location that cuts the character off from their normal world. And that could be that they're trapped in a very small room in a city somewhere, or that they're in a very alien environment to them. If we think about Jonathan Harker in Dracula, he travels across Europe, up through the Carpathian Mountains, and finds himself in a castle in the middle of a land he doesn't know, with no means of escape. So isolated locations become really, really important. And as you read through The Woman in Black, you will see the central character becomes increasingly isolated, and geography is used to do that. Extreme emotions, they're a really powerful feature of the Gothic novel. The Gothic novel was a kickback against logic and reason, and an appeal in the same way that Romantic poetry was, which was very, very focused on human emotions. The Gothic novel was about extreme emotions, extreme joy, extreme terror. Whatever it was something that was writ large. And you see this in Hill's novel, that the emotions that the characters go through are very powerful and very raw and very affecting. I find it quite a powerful novel to read. I'm sure hopefully you'll agree. Hopefully you'll find that you go on the emotional journey. But regardless of whether or not you're able to empathize, whether you do put yourself in there, you can see those emotions being described by the narrator as he goes through the journey that he goes through in narrating his tale to us. Clearly, a Gothic element is the supernatural. Now, as I said, the supernatural is not always present in all Gothic novels. There is a subset of the Gothic where what initially appears to be supernatural activity has a very, very human origin, almost the Scooby-Doo element, where they unmask the character, and they would have gotten away with it if it weren't for you pesky kids. That's a real common theme in quite a few Gothic novels, where it turns out the evil actor is in fact actually just a human. But that makes the reading any more or less comfortable is a matter of question, dependent on the individual context. But in this instance, what we're looking at is supernatural. It is a ghost story, so there is a ghost. Madness is a key concern. Frequently, what you see is characters in Gothic novels being driven to the edges of their sanity by the events that they're experiencing. They believe they're being haunted, or something terrible is happening, or they're confined, and they go through powerful emotions, and it borders on madness, borders on running out of control. And that is absolutely at the heart of this novel. When you first start into it, you see a character who begins the story by having what's best described as a panic attack. You see he's bordering on a relapse into his nervous illnesses. He describes them as nervous breakdowns, things where his mental health is affected. So this idea of mental health, and the very blunt term of madness, but the idea of loss of control of your cognitive and emotional functions is something that is at the heart of the Gothic, and it's threaded throughout the novel that Susan Hill has written. And reality versus imagination, what is real, what is not, is something that is a question that is thrown up in Gothic novels, and that is something that we see threaded again through Susan Hill's novel. Not only do we have these thematic concepts at work, we also have some stylistic concepts at work. Obviously, isolated locations probably fits both of those. It's certainly used as a literary and physical device in the novel. But here we have a couple of other things that, one of which I've already mentioned, and one of which I'll just briefly cover now, that there are actually some stylistic devices and ways of structuring the novel, some ways of writing that are also common to the Gothic novel that are found here. It's epistolary, which means that the book is a document. Now, sometimes this would be a series of letters to and fro, or journal entries, or a diary. What we get here is essentially Arthur's memoirs. We get him directly writing his experience in a very conversational first-person style. It's almost, we are being talked to by him through this idea of, I'm going to write my story down. And that idea of what we appear to be doing is reading a found document, an actual artifact. That is common to, again, if I go back to the two key examples I was referring to, the idea that Frankenstein is someone writing down a letter to their sister saying, hey, here I am, a captain trying to find my way through the northern ice. I got stuck, and guess what? I found a guy, and he told me this story. And so the captain of this ship that's trapped in the ice finds Victor Frankenstein on the ice, pursuing his monster, but half dead. And he brings him on board, and Victor unfolds his story. And the captain writes it all down and sends it off in a letter to his sister. So the idea is that the story has been written onto a document. Dracula is in the form of letters, and Jonathan Harker's journal, and letters to and from the characters. So these are found documents. The idea is presumably to give the narrative a sense of the real, that it could have happened. And we also then, in that, get the frame narrative, an excuse for the story to be told, a story within a story. And the epistolary form allows that frame narrative to take place. It's interesting to look at the writer's perspective, because you actually have a writer who is still writing, although not in the very recent past, but certainly up until about 2013, Susan Hill was still actively producing texts. She still writes articles, gives interviews, and she has a perspective. She tells us, and we have the advantage of knowing with modern texts, that what the author was attempting to do. Now, that is not the only interpretation we necessarily need to put on a text. Sometimes there are schools of thought that suggest it doesn't matter what the author intended, it's what it comes to mean to a reader that really matters. And there's a degree to which I think that is important and true, but it's very useful if we have some idea of what the writer was intending. And Susan Hill is very clear. She's not just trying to make this a ghost story, which is something that is just designed to make you jump, a kind of a pleasing thrill, as M.R. James would put it. That she's actually trying to make some serious points here. She's trying to give a level of emotional depth. She wants the ghost to have a backstory that's important. And there's a series of articles on the Guardian website where Susan Hill talks about this. That's worth doing, and I've got a link to that in one of the subsequent slides. But do feel free to have a read of that. She's very clear that she's writing a ghost story, and that her ghost story actually has a very specific set of codes and conventions, these rules that will govern what occurs. She is very clear that her ghost has to have been real, has to have been the reality of a person or an event or an animal, and in her case, we kind of get a compound of all three. And that has got to be some kind of unfinished business, some reason for the existence of the ghost. And she says that it's not just there is this set dressing, like in Gothic fictions, frequently the supernatural elements would just be a set dressing piece. Not always, but frequently they would be there to just weave part of the atmosphere. They weren't at the heart of the narrative. Here she puts the ghost and the haunting at the very, very heart of the narrative. And the other thing to note that can differentiate a ghost story from a story with a ghost in it is the idea, and particularly something like a horror story, which is meant to just jump and scare and people's heads to fall off and all kinds of unpleasant things to go spilling everywhere. That kind of the way I put it, the difference is that a horror story will often work on our disgust and our visceral reaction to a horrible thing occurring in front of us, but a ghost story unnerves and unsettles. And part of the unnerving experience is the fact that there is something hidden, and that we go through and we slowly get shown the terrible reason for the ghost to exist, and we can then unravel that mystery and solve or not solve the problem of the haunting. This draws us into the story. It kind of makes us, in some respects, part detective, and actually you could argue the ghost story has almost as much in common with the detective novel as it does with the horror story. So let's have a look at the literary heritage. There's no two ways about it. Hill has borrowed extensively from other writers. Now, this is not a criticism. I'm not saying she's copying, but she has really very thoroughly absorbed this style. And she said she wanted to write a classic ghost story of the kind that didn't seem to be written anymore. She borrows the narrative style from Dickens, first-person narration, sentence structures including parallelism. We'll have a look at that as we go through the text. Names carrying meaning. Samuel Daly, the down-to-earth. Drablow, Mrs. Drablow. If you haven't read the novel yet, you will encounter these characters. If you have read the novel, then you know them well, and you know how she's using these. And again, I'll come back to this as we go through the book itself and picking these features out as we go through. But she borrows this heavily from Dickens. And she even says she's directly inspired by Henry James's novel, The Turn of the Screw. She references this in the introduction to one of the editions of the Woman in Black. And there's no two ways about it. She's influenced by M.R. James, who's kind of the past master of the English ghost story. He even wrote about what the rules are, and Susan Hill's clearly borrowing from that. She even actually uses the title of an M.R. James ghost story in one of her stories. She's clearly well schooled in M.R. James and his style of writing. Now, I've thrown this in here because whilst we should be cautious of using any piece of writing as an autobiographical reflection of a writer's life, it is an impossible task to separate out the influences on a writer from their own life, because it's their life that has influenced them. When we look at Dickens, we see an awful lot of autobiographical features in his writing, and whilst he's never writing specifically about his individual context, he's clearly borrowing heavily from his own experience and putting bits of his own life straight into his novels. We see that explicitly in A Christmas Carol, when we have the idea of a young man separated from his family, the young Scrooge who's separated from his family and forced, in the case of the young Scrooge, to stay at a boarding house, in the case of the young Dickens to work in a factory when he's separated from his family due to their descent into poverty. You can't ignore it, that there are elements of the author's life cropping up. And there are two things that kind of stand out to me about Hill's life. Her first fiance died of a heart attack, and she lost a child. And these two kind of personal tragedies, I think, make their way into the novel. I mean, it's not definitive that these are specific elements that she's doing, but the idea that the idea of loss and bereavement from a first-hand point of view is without a doubt present in the novel. So there are a couple of other contextual elements that are worth looking at. One thing to think about is the fact that this novel is clearly set somewhere, somewhen. but neither the where or the when are made precisely clear. It is somewhere in the past, and it is somewhere on the East Coast. It is English, but are our characters in Skegness? They're somewhere in the Lincolnshire coast? Are they in North Yorkshire, Whitby Way? Where are they? It doesn't matter, actually. The idea is that they are somewhere on the East Coast, somewhere with mists and islands, etc., etc. But what Hill was, I mean, she even says it herself, she didn't want people trolling to a particular village to go and do some kind of like ghost walk in the way that people do with Dracula. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with that, but she was trying to avoid that kind of specific geographical referencing, but still trying to give it a very clear sense that this is taking place in a place that could be real, even if it isn't specifically real. The same thing is true of the time frame. It takes place in a past that at various times feels Edwardian or late Victorian, sometimes early Victorian. So we can see that there are elements of that Edwardian late Victorian context: steam trains, motor cars, telephones, but still the novel feels old. The opening chapter feels like it could have been a contemporary of Dickens's Christmas Carol. We are told that Arthur goes around putting on the lamps, but I mean they could be gas lamps or just lighting them with a taper if they were oil lamps. It's not specific enough. There's not enough detail there for us to pin it down. There's a nice article here to have a look at, which gives us an idea of sort of what the Victorian and Edwardian reality was, or not 100%, but it gives you some pictures of what life in Victorian and Edwardian life would really be like. Interesting, we get an idyllic perspective on this at the beginning of the novel. Again, she uses setting for an emotive purpose rather than specifically to set it at a particular time. But it does mean then that we have some opportunity to make some social comment. So without a doubt, the time frame gives us an access into looking at the role and treatment of women in society. That, as you read through the novel, you'll see, does feature. It's part of the story. Social class. People's perspective of people from different backgrounds. Arthur, in particular, carries a certain set of social prejudices. And the idea of the reason versus the superstition and belief. Arthur himself is something called a rational protagonist. He is an educated man of science who does not believe in ghosts. And this mindset is in part something that is responsible for his downfall. So there are some external sources there that are worth having a read through, and that concludes our introduction to Susan Hill's The Woman in Black. I hope you do enjoy reading the novel, and the next video will be chapter by chapter guides of The Woman in Black with some focus on plot, character, theme, and technique.